morning. So, like Emma said, I am a winemaker by training. I studied viticulture and enology at UC Davis, and I worked wine production in Napa Valley. Fermentation is a fundamental step in winemaking. Wine would not exist without it. So as a winemaker, I spent a lot of time thinking about the different elements and how they impact the final wine. And for example, in winemaking, if you fermented grapes in each of these three vessels, stainless steel, concrete, or wood, you'd get different results because the material has an influence on the flavor development. So stainless steel is seen as a neutral vessel. So a wine fermented in that tank would be bright and fruit-forward. If you fermented those same Chardonnay grapes in a wood barrel, you'd get more of a creamy mouthfeel and a fuller bodied, and you'd also likely get less of the fruit influence from the grapes and more vanilla coming from the wood. And the concrete egg tanks don't just look adorable. The oval shape helps influence the fermentation kinetics and encourages the wine to mix itself while it's fermenting. And the concrete has thick walls that trap pores, or that have pores that trap oxygen that interacts with the tannins in the wine to influence the mouthfeel. So you can think about this kind of like brewing your coffee in a Chemex versus a French press. The method dictates the style. So a winemaker will choose the vessel based on the style of wine they want to make. Another way that winemakers can impact the flavors coming from the fermentation is by choosing the yeast and bacteria to transform the grapes. Many winemakers spend as much time selecting the yeast for the fermentation as roasters spend profiling their coffee. And that's because even if they find a yeast that they like, each season, Mother Nature provides different growing conditions, and this year's grapes are not exactly like last year's grapes. A winemaker can also choose the yeast based on their customer's preference. Do they want a sweet Sauvignon Blanc with fruity tropical flavors or one with mineral flavors and higher acid? So a winemaker can tinker and tweak all of these fermentation conditions in a similar way that I've seen roasters modulate roast curves, obsessing over these minute details. Another example of the obsession with quality is how grapes are harvested. To avoid a spontaneous fermentation, the grapes are picked during the coolest part of the day. Some crews begin work between midnight and 2 a.m. and work until a little past sunrise to avoid the midday heat, because this heat would accelerate the activity of the wild yeasts. And because the grapes are picked at night, a winery has to own or rent these stadium-like lights to illuminate the vineyard for the pickers. Then the grapes are immediately brought into the winery and are kept cool with dry ice until they can be put into the tank. And then there's more. We add sulfur dioxide to knock back the population of wild yeast coming in from the field and clear the slate for the selected yeast. In the Napa Valley, there's very few wineries conducting wild fermentations. This is because it's a very risky thing to do. The flavors are completely unpredictable, and the biggest risk of all is that you never get wine, that the juice doesn't become wine. So a lot of winemakers go through all of this effort to avoid a spontaneous fermentation. So it was really surprising to me to learn that in coffee, a spontaneous fermentation was the norm. I work for a company that sells yeast predominantly to wineries in North America. And in 2014, Scott Laboratories sent me with a backpack full of yeast to Central America to see how we could control the process that everyone in coffee called fermentation. You may have heard me on other occasions question the use of the word fermentation to describe what is happening in coffee. That's a topic for a different time. For today's discussion, I'll continue to use the word fermentation because despite my best efforts, microbial demucilagination doesn't seem to be catching on. But maybe we can change it here. Anyway, why did we think it was a good idea to introduce yeast to coffee fermentations? Well, we saw this happen with wine. Once upon a time, this is how it was done. You pick the grapes, you stomp them with your feet, you put the juice in a vessel, and you waited for the magic to happen. You hoped for the best. If you were lucky, the juice turned into wine. But not everyone was lucky. And even the lucky ones weren't lucky every time. Depending on the ripeness of the grapes, the cleanliness of the vessel, the ambient temperature, and 100 other things you can't see, what worked one day might not work another day. This started to change in the late 1930s when selected yeast strains became available. The practice of using a selected yeast strain meant that a winemaker could have consistency from batch to batch. They were able to control some of the flavors coming from the tank, and despite what Mother Nature had to offer, were able to have that consistency. So it still took a while for this to catch on, but by the late 1980s, it was a common practice for winemakers to inoculate their fermentations, and hoping to be lucky was no longer the only strategy. And today, wineries look like this. This is Cliff Lady Vineyards in Napa Valley, and this was my office for several years. And yes, sometimes I do miss being a winemaker. Very nice place to work. But it's easy to look at this picture and forget the journey that wine had to go through, from stomping grapes with our feet to facilities like Cliff Lady. Many of us in wine today take selected strains for granted, but we forget that it wasn't immediately embraced as this great innovation. Some people heard the words consistency and uniformity and associated that with a lack of complexity. And they said, well, if everybody used the same yeast, wouldn't all wine taste the same? Well, you tell me. I don't think all wine tastes the same. Yeast is just one tool in a large toolbox. So that means that even if a winemaker in California and one in France use the same yeast on the same grapes, you can still tell the difference between a Cabernet from Napa and a Cabernet from Bordeaux. Using commercial yeast strains allowed the wine industry to improve because you no longer had to have these defects that came from poor fermentation practices. And when the fermentation was under control, and I think this part is really important, if the fermentation is under control, it frees up time for innovation in other areas. Now they could look at the effects of tank material and shape. So we wanted to see if the coffee industry could benefit in a similar way. So after 3 years, 9 countries, and 21 different fermentation trials, I've learned a lot of unexpected lessons that have shifted the trajectory of my work. When I started, I was so focused on this great idea to inoculate coffee fermentations with commercial yeast and control the flavors coming from the tank that I didn't realize there wasn't a market yet. I was like a salesperson in the 1930s selling yeast door to door to Napa 50 years too early. As I spent more and more time in Central America, speaking with highly skilled and passionate coffee producers, it became clear to me that many of them, first of all, were unaware of the opportunities of the fermentation, but were usually more interested in reducing the time and sometimes completely eliminating the fermentation. So as a former winemaker, I saw this fermentation as this exciting and rich opportunity to create flavors. But many of the people I met saw it as a liability. For them, the fermentation was when the coffee was most vulnerable to spoilage because it was unprotected by the skin. To them, quality meant reducing the time that the coffee was exposed. So Michael Sivitz contributed a lot of knowledge to the coffee industry, but one thing in particular made my job very difficult. He wrote about the risks of over-fermentation. That's another one, over-fermentation. But he said that it is well established that coffee does not improve as processing time increases. And here I was saying the opposite, that you could get higher quality from more contact, longer exposure. It's not a popular position. I thought I was offering more safety, from controlled fermentations the way we do in wine, but many people just saw more risk. And I also want to note that many of the producers I worked with were dealing with really big issues like climate change and labor shortage, unstable coffee prices, and devastating losses to plant disease like Roya. So I didn't take it too personally that advanced fermentation techniques were low on their priority list. I took it a little personally. But when I started this work, I really wanted the coffee industry and the wine industry to be similar because I wanted to apply my training. I wanted them to be similar because people I met wanted them to be similar. People I met in conferences like this one told me that specialty coffee was headed in the direction of the wine industry. I heard words that are familiar to me, words like terroir, lactic, acetic, carbonic maceration, and my favorite, fermentation. But not all similarities made sense to me. This is a refractometer used for measuring Brix. I expect to see this in every vineyard, but it's puzzling to see it on a coffee farm. I was told that producers are encouraged to measure the Brix of the cherries, also known as a sugar content, to ensure they were picking ripe cherries, because ripe cherries make better coffee. And fair enough, except that a refractometer doesn't directly measure sugar. It's an approximation of sugar. A refractometer measures dissolved solids in a liquid and gives that result as a percentage by weight. So a refractometer is really measuring density. And in wine fermentations, we actually see the Brix drop below 0 to negative numbers. Does that mean that we have negative sugar? No, it's just alcohol is less dense than fruit juice. So as the fermentation advances and there's more alcohol, you get negative Brix. And in winemaking, high sugar and ripeness are decoupled. They're correlated, but they're not interchangeable. They don't mean the same thing. Because we can have two cherries that have the same density, but different development. So these two will say the same number, but our eyes and our mouths will tell you these are different. But even though Brix is not directly measuring sugar, and even though it's not a good indicator of ripeness, it's still really, really useful in winemaking, because in winemaking, what we measure in the fruit, we can measure in the glass. A winemaker can measure the Brix of grape juice and tell you something about that wine, like the alcohol content. In coffee, we measure the Brix of the cherry juice, but cherry juice doesn't become coffee. The seed does. So we're measuring the sugar in the fruit and immediately throwing it away. And the other thing, that there's so many more processing steps in coffee that if we measure the sugar in the fruit, it's really difficult to trace it to the cup. So measuring Brix to determine ripeness in coffee is a head scratcher for me. But just to make it a little bit more confusing, I want to give you another example. This is Chateau Cheval Blanc in Bordeaux. As many coffee mills are trying to modernize and replace their concrete tanks with stainless steel versions in an effort to be more cleanable, one of the premier wineries in the world, Chateau Cheval Blanc, recently renovated, and instead of installing stainless steel tanks, they installed concrete tanks. They look like stainless steel, but they're concrete. So which cues do we follow? I understand it can be difficult to know what's worth paying attention to, what practices we should be adopting. But the point is that regardless of the material, whether the tanks are stainless steel or concrete, the winery is a place where the work of the farmer is transformed. It's a place where artisans take an agricultural product and using tradition and science, transform it into something that bears little resemblance to what came before. When we talk about coffee, we usually see pictures of a farm or coffee drying on the patio. But what happened in between? When we tell the story of coffee, it's rare to talk about how the cherry got to the patio. I think many of us would like to think of the roastery as a winery. the place where the potential energy of a green seed is transformed to the kinetic energy of a perfectly roasted bean. Before green coffee can be roasted, a cherry fruit must become green coffee. As consumers, we pay a lot of attention to the transformation at the roastery, but how much time do we spend talking about the mill? I saw so much innovation in coffee brewing and technology, but when I visited the mills, many of them are working with equipment that is decades old in facilities that were originally built 80 to 100 years ago. And I wondered why there was such a disparity between where coffee was processed and where coffee was roasted. And this is where I learned another important distinction between coffee and wine. In the Napa Valley, the wineries are located in the middle of the vineyard. So as the winery technology advances, the vineyard technology does too. So for example, if a winery gets updated glycol system for their tanks, the vineyard could get an updated irrigation system. They complement each other. They grow together. But the chain in coffee is much longer, and it's difficult to see the whole picture. I think farms and patios are very beautiful parts of coffee, but I think processing can be just as beautiful. Okay, maybe you have to be a fermentation specialist to really appreciate the beauty, but I picked these images because I've worked in both of these places, and it was working in these facilities that gave me my first clues as to how processing was viewed by the industry. I knew how the coffees I worked with were being processed, but when I tried to learn more by looking on websites or reading the packages of the coffee that I bought, I usually would see a word or two. Maybe it would say honey, or pulp natural, or washed, or semi-washed, wet process. And what I've learned in talking to different people and my travels is that those two, there's very little consensus as to what those words mean. In fact, the thinking is so pervasive that most people refer to a mill as a washing station, like the coffee is making a neutral stop on the way out of the country. For the people that I work with, the producers in Central America, the role of the mill is coded into the language, hidden in plain sight. In Spanish, the word for mill is beneficio, a benefit. How does it change the conversation if we start to view the mill this way? How can we benefit the quality of coffee? How can we benefit the quality of lives of the workers? How can we benefit the environment where coffee is processed? I'm up here as a fermentation specialist, but what I've realized is that my yeast trials have the potential to impact all of these things. Using yeast is just one way to mitigate some of the risks that producers face on a daily basis. Most notably, we can reduce defects so that we can extend the contact time to increase the cup score and the complexity of the coffee, and we can do it while reducing the amount of water used to process the coffee. So controlled fermentation lets us flip the risk. In the field, the plant creates the building blocks that will be transformed at the beneficio into flavor precursors that will be transformed again by the roaster into what we taste in the cup. Sitting on the demand side of the supply chain, there's a constant push for higher quality, while at the same time keeping risk at arm's length and romanticizing some of these practices at origin that have been unchanged for 100 years. I'm not saying all tradition should be discarded, but stomping grapes with our feet was a cherished practice until it was replaced with something better. The risk is not in trying new things like yeast, but in failing to question the practices of the last 100 years. Looking ahead at the challenges that coffee faces from climate change, disease, labor shortage, and market pressures, we need to get realistic and help share the risk that disproportionately burdens producers. I think we need to be prepared to support the innovators at Origin who are willing to question their own traditions. It's these innovators that understand that we can't just hope for the best results like our ancient winemakers. We need to select it. Thank you.